smart, smarter, smart objects. Yes, welcome to the Russell Brown Show, and this project, which is especially designed for graphic designers working on packaging. Let's zoom into this project and just see what a smart object can do for you. As we get in here closer, we can see that I have a label design here placed on this bottle. It is distorted and warped around the edges. Stay tuned for how Mr. Brown has done that. But let's take a look at this smart object. Double-clicking here on this icon from within the Layers palette, which, by the way, indicates that this is a smart object. By doing this and double-clicking, you open up this layer. You can now edit the objects inside of this first set. As you see here, I'm going to simply move this object over here to the right, then close this window and save it. And amazing but true, it moves the position of that graphic right there. But wait, we can also do a Command Z on the Macintosh or a Control Z on the PC and undo that last change. But let's go even farther. Double-clicking on this first smart object, then double-clicking again on this nested smart object inside of the first reveals the original Photoshop file that contains all my text and layers and graphics for this label. I can, for example, target this layer, then move in and move this text down. I could even go into this layer and adjust the size of a graphic. By adjusting these and changing them, we can then save them, and it will then update all the way back to our original. You don't believe me? Watch this. Closing this first one and saving it will then update this stage. Watch, there's the update. Then closing this window and saving it will save it back to our original. The great capability here is that you get to change your label design interactively, and you do not have to throw away your layers. So that's what a nested smart object can do for you as a graphic designer. Let's select these two layers and let's throw them down here in the trash and start from the beginning. Okay, here we are on our original bottle photograph with no graphics. I'm now going to take you through a step-by-step process of creating this nested smart object. Let's move this down here into position and analyze this project. The first thing I need to do is to determine how these graphics will warp around this bottle. And in fact, I'm going to use the new warp feature found in Photoshop CS2 to do that. I'm first going to wrap the bottle, as you see here in this photograph, with a grid that I've printed out. Then, as you see in this photo, I've photographed the bottle in position with this grid on the surface. I can then go in and place a smart object grid over this photograph and use it as a template. Of course, you do not need to place a grid around your bottle as I have done in this project in order to make this whole process work. You can, of course, place your smart object grid over your surface and bend and distort it using your own built-in skills of perspective. I just thought you should know that. So here we go. From the File menu, I'm going to go down to Place. Then I'm going to locate my vector grid art. It happens to be an Adobe Illustrator file. I'm going to place it now, selecting the Place button and selecting OK. So now I can position my grid here with my Move tool until it lines up with my grid on my bottle. This grid that I'm placing on top as a smart object is the same grid that I used and printed out for the piece of paper that is wrapping around the bottle. So, if I scale this now, I should be able to match it up exactly. Holding down the Shift key here and clicking in the upper right hand corner, I can start to scale this down until it lines up with the grid right about there. Then I'm going to hit the Enter key, and then I'm going to use the Move tool again to position this just like that. That looks pretty good. My next step is to actually warp this grid around the contour shape of this bottle. But let's just step back and analyze what's going on, because this step is critical to understanding this whole process. This grid that I've placed was an Adobe Illustrator file. When I placed it and hit the Enter key, you'll notice here in the Layers palette that the icon has changed here, indicating that it's a placed smart object. So, placing an Illustrator file automatically creates a smart object. Now if we double click on this layer, it reveals the Illustrator file contained within. I could make adjustments to this file within Adobe Illustrator or just leave it as is. In this case, I'm going to make no adjustments and just switch back to Adobe Photoshop because I want to show you my next step, which is to actually create what's called a nested smart object. And that's the key to success with this whole process. It's to understand about nesting smart objects so that you can, of course, in this case, warp the outer layer, but all the objects inside of the nested object will warp with it. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to move over here to this flyout arrow from the Layers palette. Click here and go down to Group into New Smart Object. So we're taking the Illustrator file and nesting it inside of another smart object, just like that. Now the icon didn't change any here in the Layers palette, but it really is nested. Because watch what happens now. When we double click here in the Layers palette on this smart object layer, we might expect Adobe Illustrator to open as it did before, but instead we're opening up a Photoshop layered document. And the Illustrator file is contained within this file. If I double click here on this vector grid art, once again, we can see here that we're now back in Adobe Illustrator and we actually see the vector art that we created. So you can see as we go back in this whole process, I've nested the Illustrator file into a second smart object, and thus I can then work with it in this nested form and place all of my graphics into this space. My Photoshop graphics and my Illustrator graphics can all go into this area because when I close this, it's this outer shape that I want to distort and warp. I hope you're starting to understand this process of nested smart objects because it is, of course, the key to success. Be sure and watch my Smart Objects Basic Movie once again if you're still a little bit lost in this process. Okay, let's continue. Now, I can go over here to the Edit menu again and down to Free Transform. Then up here to the Options bar, I can warp this. Watch this. I can now grab the corners of this grid and I can bend it around and stretch it to any location I want. In this particular project, I'm going to take you through a workflow that works best for warping these images. Let's get going. First, I'm going to zoom in just a bit more, here to about 100%. Then use my spacebar key to position myself here in the upper right-hand corner of this bottle label. Then, moving in here, I can click on this corner and drag and stretch this corner till it lines up with the blue grid on the bottle. So my first step is to line up all the corners of this. Just like this. I'm moving by holding down my spacebar key, and then it reveals my hand tool and I can move the graphic just like this. So again, the spacebar key switches back here and I can move this with my arrow tool. I want to align all four corners first. Then let's zoom back out just a bit, position this in the middle, and the next step is to move these side control arms. I want to move them in just like this till they line up with the edge of the wine bottle. Remember, this may seem a little difficult, but you only have to warp this graphic once and you can use it several times. Again, here on the left, I'm bending this in till it lines up with the edge. I'm lining up the edges, and now let's zoom in a bit for a little bit more detail. Back to 100% again. You'll notice that there's a feature as I call it, where the grid appears flat and not distorted. To get rid of this, I hit the Enter key once. It then renders the graphic grid into position, and then you can transform it again, Command T on the Macintosh or Control T on the PC, and go back up here to Warp Image, up here in the Options bar. Now the grid displays correctly. You now can go in and reposition your points once again. Now in this case, I'm going to take this control arm at the top, and I'm going to bend it out and down until the vertical lines line up with my blue grid in the background, right here. I'm going to scroll over here to the left. I'm going to do the same here on the left-hand side. I'm going to click on this control arm and stretch and bend these lines over to the left like this. You'll notice that the lines on the right have altered. The process is to go back and forth from left to right until you stretch the graphic to match the design of the grid in the background. Just like that. Let's scroll down to the base here, and let's do the same down here in the base. I'm lining up the vertical lines as well as the horizontal lines in this process, stretching to the right and stretching to the left. Then going back to the right again. Notice how it slowly stretches back and forth. You have to do a little bit of left, then a little bit of right, just like that. That looks pretty good. So now it's time to move here to the center. I'm going to click here on the grid, and once again I'm going to stretch it to the right, and then click on the grid and stretch it to the left. Boy, that looks pretty good. A little bit of adjustment here on the left over here with these control arms will bring these back into position, and this will bring this back into position like that. A little bit more of adjustment here on the inside, and everything's starting to line up. Let's check it up here at the top. A little bit of adjustment to bring this curvature up a little bit more, and let's check it down here at the bottom. That looks pretty good. Let's zoom back out and take a look at this. Let's hit our Enter key. Looks perfect. Now we can turn off this photographic grid, and we only see our distorted grid. It's this distortion that's going to help us apply our graphics over the surface. So we're done with that. So now let's go up here and double click on this vector grid art to reveal the smart object contained within. Double clicking on that now reveals this second level. Our grid is still flat in this level. So the artwork we're looking at now is the same artwork we see here on the bottle. It's just that on the outside it's been distorted by the transformation of the warp. So now we want to place graphics inside of this space. Let's go up here to the File menu again and down to Place. So here we have the graphics we're going to place onto the bottle. I can place both Illustrator files and Photoshop files. Let's start here with a Photoshop file. This is the original file that I created for this label. I've placed it here into my grid space. If I hit my Enter key, it resolves the graphic down and renders it at this size. And of course, since this is a placed Photoshop file, it has automatically become a smart object as you see here. And as we all know, you can rotate it, warp it, and distort it, and the original Photoshop file contained within can still be edited and has not been altered. It, of course, is a non-destructive process. Okay, let's turn off the grid. We do not need that anymore. Now we can position our graphic down here, right there, within this space. We can close this file and select Save. Watch what happens. We now have our graphic placed here on the bottle. Let's zoom in a bit so we can see what's happening here. Okay, I think you're starting to understand what just happened. We placed the grid into position over the bottle in our nested set of smart objects. We distorted the grid. We then placed our graphic inside of the same distortion space, turned the grid off, and of course the graphic will distort to the same way the grid distorted. The grid was merely used as a reference for wrapping the shape around the bottle. Okay, let's go on. we now can see that we need to bring in this reflection, and we need to have the edges of the label fade off around the edges of the bottle. To do that, I'm going to create a layer mask. But first, let's zoom back out a bit so we can see more of our image right about there. Then I'm going to go over here to my tabbed channels palette, and you'll see down here at the base an alpha channel that I created earlier. I'm going to click on that so you can see it. Here you can see I drew a shape around the bottle, then filled this shape with a gray value. Of course, the area outside the bottle is black. I don't want to see any of that area. But let's look at this closely. The inside of the bottle is one value of gray, and this band, which represents the highlight on the bottle, is yet another value of gray. And also, as you'll notice, the edges of the bottle have a slight blur to them and a small gradient. This will ensure that the edges of the label blend in smoothly around the shape of the bottle. Of course, we know that when you apply a layer mask, the value of gray determines the amount of masking that's taking place. I'm going to load this as a selection, holding my cursor here over the icon for Alpha Channel 1, then holding down my Command key on the Macintosh and my Control key on the PC. I can click on that and load this alpha channel I created. Then let's go back here to our RGB image by clicking here at the top, then clicking my layers to make sure I'm targeting the correct layer. In this case, it's my vector grid art layer, my smart object layer. Now, with my alpha channel selected, I can now go down here to the base of the layers palette and click on Add Layer Mask. Watch what happens. Bingo. Let's bring this up in size so we can see this more clearly. Right about there. If I turn this alpha channel off now, you can clearly see how it's affecting this image. Here I'm going to hold down the Shift key, then click on this icon. So here's before, and then after. So you can see the added value that a layer mask can bring to this project. There you have it. We've finished our project. I've shown you how to create a nested smart object when designing packaging. So, give these techniques a try the next time you're trying to be smart, smarter, or even trying to create smart objects.